Hey everybody, how you doing? I'm Marc Ross. We are here on Ructions podcast where we talk about global stories, geopolitics, and stuff we're reading, watching. Joining me today, as always, my compatriot, my comrade, my brother in arms, Gerald Ashley. Gerald, how are you?
I'm well. That's quite a build-up. I kind of peaked already. Let's bore the viewers and listeners by droning on about. I've just had hip operation number 2, and like most people who have hip operations, they go on and on and on about how life-changing it is. I had the first one last summer. I knew this one was coming up, just to the way of things. It's gone extremely well, and so no more talk about whining about hips and surgery in the future. So yeah, I'm in good form.
Well, yeah, that'll probably be me in 12 months. So stand by, dear listeners. All right, speaking of operations, should we talk about the Bank of England? What is going on? I hear all this mortgage madness. They're what the interest rate's now 5%. I don't know. A lot of calamity, a lot of chaos. Certainly a lot of dire headlines for number 10. I don't know. Is it what should we know about what's happening with the mortgage situation, the inflation rate, the Bank of England?
It's not a good story, or it's not a good news story. I suppose this has been the inevitable sort of end game for what has been a slow-mo car crash. And it's been a slow-mo car crash because the Bank of England, for whatever reasons, and you can kind of pick your own reasons if you like, have been slow to pick up on the growth of inflation. I mean, some people would go so far as to say they've been woefully slow. They've been almost incompetent. Maybe a more nuanced view was that they've been caught out, and here we go again, by their models of the economy. And in the same way as in the UK, I don't know so much in the States, but in the UK we suffered all sorts of nonsense by statisticians and sort of model makers on predictions of COVID. I fear the Bank of England has fallen in exactly the same trap. And the reason is kind of interesting because, why did we have low interest rates for so long? Well, initially it was, if anybody can remember that long ago, it was because of the global financial crisis of 0809. Now, there's a strong argument in retrospect, in hindsight, to say that there was far too much monetary easing and far too much accommodation of government spending during the teens. And when COVID arrived, everybody sort of rushed to spend more money again. And in a way, unremarkably, the bill has arrived. It was quite nice, wasn't it, in 2021, 22? Oh, the government gives me money and there's no great cost to this. I mean, some people may have been deserving causes, but a hell of a lot of people, probably myself included, got a nice free run out of money from the government. And now the bill has arrived, and it's arrived in two forms. It's arrived in terms of inflation, and it's arrived somewhat later in terms of the Bank of England having to react to that with interest rate rises. And we should always remember, separate from what a central bank can do, are yields on bonds. And yields on bonds have been screaming trouble for many months, and trouble has arrived big time in the last few weeks for the Bank of England. Rishi Sunak will no doubt be aware of the old phrase of problems don't come singly, they come in battalions. And he's had a battalion of problems this week, and it's all kind of come to a head. And to be frank, it's very difficult to see a good economic outcome, and from a conservative point of view, a pretty disastrous political one. I mean, we've got to be careful about hyperbole and all the rest of it. But if things don't turn for the government soon, I think we're going to see mayhem in politics in 2024, which of course is, from your reaction, is exactly what you're hoping for. So 2024 is shaping up to be a big, settlement or sorting out of what may have been 10 or 20 years of nonsense.
Well, I think mayhem makes sense for Glastonbury. which is happening this weekend. Maybe you'll be there. But yeah, in terms of politics, economics, this is not a great word you want to see. I'm struck by two things. So here in the States, so the mortgage situation, a lot of people got locked. Like we have the ability to refinance, I guess much more liberally than you do in the UK. So a lot of people that were able to able to lock in interest rates, especially mortgages at 2%. Which is interesting because people have these amazing mortgages, so good that they're afraid to move. So like the
Yeah.
housing velocity is kind of screwed up now here in the States. And there's this idea maybe you buy the house, you buy the mortgage as well.
Yeah.
But I was really surprised by this. And we have longer 15, 30 year, mortgage options, settled rates for 30 years, pretty good. I didn't realize the UK is much more, I guess, flexible or much more adherent to the inflation rate. It's not as locked in, so to speak.
Well, I'd be a bit careful about that, actually, Mark. I think you can certainly get a 30-year mortgage here, and you can flip between fixed and floating. But we have a cohort of people through no fault of their own in their 20s, or at the time they're in their 20s, or probably more likely in their 30s, who genuinely thought that 5% was an horrific interest rate. So why on earth would you do anything and just jog along on month by month or quarter by quarter, paying 0.5%? And when the opportunity came to lock in at what looked fairly high at 2.5% or 3%, not a huge number of people took that up. You are right in terms of duration. There are a hell of a lot of people on 2-year mortgages. We shouldn't overstate this, but around, I believe, 15 to 20% of mortgages will come up for renewal in the next year to 18 months. One of the problems in Mr. Sunak's battalion. And you make a point where we are very similar to the United States, where people who have got unbelievable deals, and there were unbelievable deals out there, essentially can't move or won't move. And of course, that's bad for the economy. If you've got a good job and you've got to move house with it, and you say, well, actually, sorry about the good job. I've got a nice, solid, certain set of financing here. I'm not going to move. So this is slowing things up. And this, in a funny sort of way, is causing inflation. Because I think a lot of people think of inflation in terms of demand, that it's always driven by demand. But here it may be driven by supply, in the fact that there is restricted supply. You and I have been batting on for ages about, over the last 18 months, supply chains, and then how the world has never quite got back to normal, and then whether people are going to have to be forced back into their offices, this, that, and the other. And it's just another element that shows that the flexibility of labour isn't what it was and could be inflationary. And if you want to really chuck a brick in the pond, you could make an argument that raising interest rates is inflationary, because all you're doing is adding to people's household bills, and so you may be embedding the problem. Now, it's easy as a commentator or an outsider to, as a backseat driver, to say what to do, but there's very much a school of thought that says they need to stop raising rates. They shouldn't have raised this week, and shock horror, maybe they should half think about even easing them maybe at the end of the year or the first quarter of next year. So I'm afraid the Bank of England they started with too little too late, and they've ended up with too much too late. Not good.
Yeah, I want to talk about inflation because I've got some good data points I want to share. I'm also very curious about just the psychology of money, in the sense of when you feel you're quote unquote wealthy, regardless of the economic numbers or what the interest rate is. Like there's just like the idea of like, I feel good, I'm going to spend money. But then I was talking to a restaurateur this week. He is an expert. He's done all kinds of concepts, and he was telling me, he was like, you can tell when things are back to normal. He's like, look at your French fries. And I was like, okay. And he's like, if they're darker, that means they're recycling the oil, because the oil has gotten so freaking expensive.
Wow.
That they're like they're using it 2 or 3 times. Whereas
that's an interesting metric.
Well, he was saying, it used to be like $5 a gallon for fry oil. Now it's like $25. And he's like, you can't charge, $10 for fries. So customers won't do it. And the other day, my wife and I just got some like fast casual Greek food, and we spent like $40. And I was like, we just got a few shawarmas and hummus. Like, how is this $40? And then, so that gives you the sense of like, oh, maybe, I should be like not spending this money because it's not worth it, or I feel cheated. And the psychology of it is interesting. But the restaurant space is one to watch because it's so sensitive. The margins are so low. The quality, are you getting extra food? Those are kind of interesting like psychology points that I look for, as opposed to just the numbers that the BOE or the Fed are looking at.
I agree with all of that. And I think the metric that you'll be familiar with from your time in the UK, people always ask how much a pint of beer is.
Right.
And that's got a sort of national quality to it, in that London's always outrageously expensive. And out in the countryside, you pay that bit less. Viewers and listeners are going to correct me because I'm not a big beer drinker, but I think I'm right in saying now a pint of beer is nudging on £8 a pint in London. Yeah. I mean, I used to think it was horrific when it was £4.
I think that's like $12, right, or something.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. It's not fun. Well, yeah, you're making sterling sound.
Normally, I drink champagne, so I would have no idea what beer costs, but that's outrageous.
You're certainly north of $10. You're certainly $10. And this isn't a craft beer. This is some junk that's come out the back of a lorry, and people feel this. But what's quite interesting is statistics came out earlier today and yesterday, showing that the UK consumer is kind of hanging on and is still spending. But that may be because of this slow-mo on the mortgage rates. As renewals come up and people's monthly payments, drop out of the old financing into a new one, then it'll hit them. I don't think it's a cliff edge, but there is a sort of rolling, grinding increase in this, the number of people who are going to suffer, basically.
And it becomes like a narrative. Like if you're surrounded by it and you see it everywhere, like getting back to the psychology of it, I saw the story in the Boston Globe this week, part of the country well in the U.S., Cape Cod. And the story was all about rentals. Why are there so many extra rentals this year? Is it because of cost? Is it because of the food prices? If I have to go out to dinner, is it because of Airbnb's, extra fees to exit? Really... But it's all this kind of like psychology of like the hassle of it. It's expensive. It's not fun. Yeah. And that doesn't show up in the Financial Times. Like that is like a Boston Globe story that everybody can understand. Like, I can't afford to go on vacation.
I agree. And I think here's a statistic that slightly knocked me sideways, is that with the exception of something like less than half a dozen Conservative seats in Parliament, all the rest have more than 50% owner-occupiers. So there's a hell of a lot of people will have paid their mortgage off, certainly in kind of the, my boomer generation, or what the hell we are. But there's a hell of a lot of people who haven't, and who are in, they're not just Tory swing seats here. I mean, this is absolutely front, middle, and centre, and that folds back into my point earlier on about 2024 could be a bit of a humdinger.
Well, speaking of humdinger, let's talk about elections. 2024 is shaping up to be a battle royale on both sides of the North Atlantic. UK elections, most likely. U.S. election, definitely happening. What do you want to say? Do you want to go first? Do you want to talk about...
Let's get the UK out of the way very quickly. I think Rishi Sunak will do exactly the same as John Major and Gordon Brown, and he'll hang on to the death.
That is, be on corporate boards by 2025.
I think the absolute death, again, open to correction, I think it is early December 24. So he may well go in that autumn of 24, avoid having a party conference or whatever. Maybe if we were going to put $5 on it, let's say October 24. I can't see any reason why they would go early. Why commit suicide earlier than you need to? And so what else is going on?
That should be a book, by the way. I think you've missed your calling. That's you could be on Oprah with that kind of mantra. Why kill yourself now when you can do it later?
Yeah, you should be making notes of all of this. You know, I mean, come on. I think there are other aspects that are not just about the Tory party. And the key one, funnily enough, is we're back to our friends in Scotland, is how well are the Scottish nationalists going to hang together with all this fiasco of their finances or alleged problem with their finances? And will the Labour Party vote recover? Because realistically, if Sir Keir Starmer and co are going to take control, they really need to do well in Scotland. And the early evidence is they're likely to. The last element in this is a huge disaffected number of Tory voters who don't know where to go. And they're disaffected for two reasons. They either love Brexit and feel nothing has happened, or they hate Brexit and they feel betrayed by the Tory party. So how do you square that circle if you're the Tories? Paradoxically, probably the winners will be two sorts. You will see more voting to Liberal Dems, which will maybe take quite a lot of Tory seats away in the south. You'll see a proportion of the blue wall go back to Labour, and you'll see, brace yourselves for some sort of Nigel Farage lookalike, may not be him directly, that will reappear and may strip 5% of the votes off for Tory. Now, in a first past the post, sorry about that system, if the Tories can't get over 30% of the vote, their seats in the Houses of Parliament absolutely collapse. They're at 29%. Interesting.
Yeah, you're spot on about Scotland. I think that is definitely a nation or constituency, however you want to talk about it. Last time Labour was in charge, Gordon Brown held a Scottish seat. So it's definitely in play. And I think if Labour can kind of sort out the Brexit, the independence, I don't know, soft pedal it there, it seems they can do well there. As we're recording this, today is the 23rd. Did you know today is the 7th anniversary of Brexit, June 23rd, 2016, 7 years on.
And I would suggest we're now about a quarter of the way through it.
Yeah, and I think go ahead.
And I would say I don't actually say that in jest, because I think the other element, and this is away from elections, but it's part and parcel of everything we talked about, part and parcel of the Bank of England, is the British establishment outsourced government and administration of this country to the EU for the last 30 or 40 years. So you've had a really easy job if you've been a politician or you've been a senior administrator in government circles, because when you just joined in with everything with the EU, you just ticked every box. And then if it didn't work, you blamed them, and then you shrugged your shoulders and say, oh, sorry, but we're good members and we have to get on with it. So my contention, which may be controversial, is to say we have an unbelievably weak cohort of politicians. We've got a load of over-promoted pygmies, and they are, they really are very third-rate people. But then we've only needed third-rate people, and this cuts across political lines. I mean, you struggle to name really top draw senior politicians on either side of the house, to be honest.
That's some. I love the analysis too, because I actually know. I mean, just experience-wise, doing the geopolitical stuff, where countries encourage alliances or treaties to shape their internal politics. Like, they would never say that publicly, but they certainly say, hey, we need you to, and then go back and say, oh, we have to do this. This is part of the deal. Like, you can look at all kinds of treaties or climate change or deals like that. So that certainly happens. And the peace and prosperity that we've enjoyed is unprecedented, in my mind. I mean, it's going on now 7 decades, and we haven't had made big decisions. And I also remind people, especially here in the States, I'm like, listen, it is a representative government. Like, the people that come to DC are picked from other people in America. These are Americans. We're not, not everybody's a genius, so that's part of it.
I would take a small issue with you about peace and prosperity. We certainly have had peace, but prosperity has been much more patchy for the last 20 or 30 years. And that's why we've seen the rise of populist movements.
Yeah.
And, there is evidence, that in the United States, the average worker is not any better off after taxes and inflation than he was 30 years ago. And I think that has some political consequences.
But it's also, how you measure this stuff too, because to your earlier point, I think about Uber or all these kind of ridiculous, VC funded services that were essentially heavily discounted, right? Because there was cheap money. But if you look at an Uber right now, it's equivalent to any other, transport taxi situation. It's no more cheaper.
Basically,
where it used to be.
The market is normalized, and this
it's not subsidized anymore by cheap money. So you're right. Like prosperity has been maybe it hasn't shown up in paychecks, but it showed up in like cheap food or cheap transportation, cheap holidays.
No, I think that's a very valid comment, and that's the problem about the shock horror 5% interest rate scenario, which is that people, don't realize that some of the services they've been enjoying at huge price discounts or almost free, unquote, have been because, as you say, interest rates have been close to zero, and so that's all gonna get washed away, I think, or is being.
Yeah, and here in the States, what's interesting, so Will Hurd, former member of Congress from Texas, got into the race yesterday, announced on a morning show video, interesting. Anyways, he's the 11th or 12th Republican that's gotten in, which, is telling. That means Trump hasn't closed the deal. DeSantis hasn't closed the deal. People are thinking about their future, raise their profile. We'd love a horse race here in the States, the way we treat politics. So, and Biden's numbers are absolutely atrocious. His press conference yesterday, listen, I support my president. I want Biden to succeed, but, watching him interact, he is not as spry, and he's old, and it's a hell of a job. This is a really interesting mix of what's happening here in the States. But more people are getting into the race shows that there's a lot of interest, a lot of ambition, and that the front runners aren't scaring people off. So I could even see more people getting in the next few weeks just to make it interesting.
I think this all tees up, here we are. This is the trailer for 2024, isn't it? I mean, there's, things are not going to be like they are now in January 25. In some ways, and in other ways, I think in UK politics, it'll be different parties, same nonsense. And I think the really interesting period, and depending on your views on these things, maybe dangerous period, is going to be post 24. That if the electorate find that we've just, that you do end up with Biden or Trump, and everybody says, we would have preferred anybody, but here we are, we've got one of these two guys again. And if the Labour Party just turns out to be exactly like the same as the Tories, but just different people saying the same platitudes, where does this all go? I mean, this isn't, not a good situation, I don't think.
And too, I think, obviously we can't predict the future. History is better looked at in the past, but I think we're coming to the end of this kind of like Thatcher, Reagan, Warsaw Pact, commanding heights of the economy. India wants more of a say in the world. China certainly wants more of a say in the world. Germany's caught between, are we pro-US, pro-China, Saudi Arabia? I don't know. And it's exciting to see. I'm sure it'll all work out positively and swimmingly, but it does seem we're coming up to the end of a generation and we're going into a new phase of the world, which is exciting.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And then if you want to take the pessimistic good grief approach, people might want to take a look at the history of 1848. And 1848, when there was a large number of revolutions across Europe, and for the very reason that there was an out-of-touch elite and administrative class that took no notice of what was going on at street level, and of course it ended very badly. I'm not suggesting we're going to get that or anywhere near it, though it's worth saying that the rise of right-wing parties in Europe is on the march again. Madame Le Pen is making all sorts of noises again, which we know she does from time to time, but these guys haven't gone away. And as I say, 2024 and onwards, going to be interesting.
I love it. Yeah, revolution seemed fun as a witness, as a reader of history, but I don't know. As a participant, I don't know. Doesn't seem that exciting.
No, revolutions are great to read about. You absolutely don't want to be involved in them, I think.
Speaking of revolution, well, maybe not. NATO. The reason we bring this up, the NATO summit's in 2 weeks. As an aside, they can't sort out who's going to be the next leader of NATO. And Ukraine is desperate to get some kind of security deals out of this. Zelensky this week was talking about Russian terrorism taking down the nuclear plant. I don't know. I think the next 2 weeks are really interesting. Ukraine's going to be front and center. NATO, all the regular people. Ben Wallace has been pushed to the side by supposedly Joe Biden and the Americans because they don't want him taking over NATO, or maybe they want him in the UK. I think it's the latter. And then who's going to take this role over? Does Steinberg stay in that position? NATO, big time. And I think the other interesting thing about NATO, they're going to open an office in Tokyo. So NATO has no bounds now. The map of NATO is the world, and interesting summit to watch.
That could possibly be a weakness if it loses its focus. We get a little bit of imperial overstretch.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we get a little bit of imperial overstretch, and we haven't actually got a solid view within NATO of what its objectives truly are. We never go through a program without having a word about your friend President Macron. And I think it's true to say that President Macron is not the world's greatest fan of NATO, and is certainly not.
He once called it brain dead.
Well, there's a small hint in his phrase there, isn't it? And I think he would be very much against too much expansion. If anything, I think as you say, he's probably not very positive on the whole thing. Does this matter? Yes. What will happen, Lord only knows. Maybe to pull the focus down again back to the Ukraine and Russia situation. Okay, it's only a fortnight ago when we first said this, but this sort of stalemate war in Ukraine looks more and more likely to me, unless the Russians go completely bananas with serious weapons. They're not going to win, and the West is going to do just enough to stop Ukraine from losing. And so, at what point is somebody going to tap a shoulder on Zelensky, or on Zelensky's shoulder, or maybe more difficult to tap on Mr. Putin's shoulder and say, we got to cut a deal? And that may be 12, 18 months away. But it's kind of feeling that it's kind of played to a level. Now, I know at the personal level, people say things, this is dreadful, that, there's been the most terrible suffering by civilians, of course, and loss of property and wealth, and just horrific all round. But I'm afraid we're in the world of realpolitik here. And realpolitik is going to say, actually, maybe this game is a stalemate, and we need to stop it.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. You've been mentioning that. I think your analysis is quite interesting and quite important. And maybe the solution doesn't come from the normal, hotshot Big Five countries.
Yeah.
Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor for the Biden administration, FT has a story. He's on his way to Copenhagen at the request of quote the global South, which is headed by Brazil and India, who. Their role in this as a commodity provider, Ukraine provides a lot of commodity products to the global South. And as we talked about earlier, India and Brazil want a bigger say in what's happening in the world. So I don't know, maybe this comes from elsewhere. You could see, though, how Ukraine, even if there's quote unquote a solution or some kind of deal, it's hard to see Russia not coming back in 30 years or, even 10 years to try to take Ukraine back.
That's for another time. But, one feels something needs to be done here. And as you mentioned earlier, and I got a feeling you've probably got it on one of your cards, India is increasingly a key player in many things. And, if they wanted to walk onto the world stage, this is a good opportunity from a diplomatic point of view to try and help cut a deal. But it's not going to be quick and easy. Far from it, I don't think.
Well, in fact, you are a mind reader. Maybe you are a magician. Maybe you have psychic powers. Because here's the card. India. Narendra Modi. In town, Washington, D.C., state dinner, speech to Capitol Hill. They rolled out the red carpet. They've given all the love. They even had a vegetarian menu last night at the dinner. America, loves India, and rightly so. There's a lot of Indians ancestry, folks that have
Yeah,
connection to India population. They'd be willing to look. It'd be great if you have a chance to look at the guest list. All the top CEOs from Silicon Valley that have Indian connection were there.
yeah.
But the amount of love India is getting is it's really something I don't think Americans have fully appreciated. I go back to April when Apple opened a retail store in Delhi. And sure enough, guess who was at the dinner last night? Tim Cook of Apple. So that really
Yeah.
gives you a sense of the Americans are looking at this militarily, socially. There's a caucus dedicated to Indian cuisine on Capitol Hill now. I don't know. I've never really seen anything. I saw a lot of this going back to the financial crisis in 08, 09, where the Americans were keen to work with the Chinese, to be totally honest.
Yeah.
And when that hasn't transitioned the way they hope to, a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, especially in America's highest levels, are looking towards India. And Modi's quite a character, certainly somebody to watch, vision, all that good stuff. And
Also,
then with the connection, obviously, to the UK, I think India is really poised for an interesting generational run here.
no, I think they're well positioned in a whole heap of ways. Um, One of the critical ones, which is a very much a slow burn, but it's slow but steady, is their demographic advantage. Their demographic advantage of the percentage of young people versus old people is particularly attractive. At the very point, almost of the year, that the Chinese demographic just ever so slightly slips into reverse. And it will take maybe 5, 10, 15 years for us to notice a great deal. But may seem hard to say now or believe now, but China's population is likely to shrink over the next 40 or 50 years. And this plays back to this point of, his presidency at his maximum point now in terms of influence, economic power, effort, and all the rest of it. The Chinese aren't going away. They're going to be incredibly important in the future. But maybe they're just going to, the foot's off the gas a little bit for them. And the Americans who, as you say, have given up on China in many ways, or certainly loosened their desire to be with China. India is the obvious partner, and so it's hard to be bearish about India over the next 20 years. I think they're going to do very well.
But India, as you know, has got some challenges. Nationalism, their history, they definitely have got the anti-colonialism vibe. They've bought a staggering amount of weapons from the Russians, which makes it complicated to set up a military partnership when their kit, their equipment is from Russia. It's interesting.
Yeah, I don't think it's one of these overnight deals and everything's done. But I just think the direction of travel is now changed. That
the momentum is spot on. The momentum is there, but the challenge is, anybody who's visited India, it's it's rough and ready, and there are parts of the infrastructure that are 100 years behind. I recall this story about this engineer from Australia who was there to build a bridge in some community. Very eager, very type A guy. Let's go. And woke up the day and was like, where's the crew? What's happening? And the mayor said, listen, man, we haven't had a bridge for 5,000 years. So, if you wait another day, it's not really going to matter. And that's kind of the interesting part about India. Fascinating place, but it's always been, why isn't it more powerful right now than it is? That's an interesting story.
And that in a way is the one ace card the Chinese have, which is their work ethic. And that will take them a long way. But as I say, the long, slow grind economically probably will start to flip towards India. And of course, the West are desperate to do something in terms of security in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia and all the rest of it. So I can see why Mr. Biden and all across the American body politic are keen on India. It's lots of curries all round for everyone.
Modi, who spoke for over an hour yesterday to a joint session of Congress, which is a high honor here in the United States. There are several things he mentioned. It's worth watching the presentation, I think. But one of the things he mentioned, that he said there are 2,500 political parties in India. That's a lot. That's a lot of democracy.
I'm surprised you're still in Washington, Mark. I thought you would be packing your bags for.
That number. I was like, there must be at least 10,000 full-time. At least there probably even 100,000 campaign jobs
this
in
is
India.
The career opportunity of a lifetime for you, Mark, to get out to New Delhi and to say to at least 20 and 30, forget the other 2,500. I can turn you into a really professional political party in return for a modest payment.
Get out the vote, yeah. In term to a ownership in an Indian Premier League cricket team. All right. Should we wrap up with what we're reading and watching?
Okay.
Do you want to go first? What are you reading and watching, Gerald?
Well, here's a hostage to fortune. But I mentioned very briefly a couple of weeks ago, a book was coming out called Material World, as by a UK Sky News journalist, excuse me, called Ed Conway. People on Twitter should follow Ed Conway. He's not your average rent-a-quote journalist. He does his homework. And here's the book to prove I've actually, not just talking about it, I've got it. And it's not a slim one, I'm afraid, but it's a very easy read. Quite a light journalistic style, absolutely jam-packed with facts. And he talks about the world through the prism of 6 materials. And I'll just read these off. And some are more obvious than others. He talks about sand, iron, copper, salt, oil, and lithium. Sand, you might think, what the hell are we talking about sand? Well, of course, there's glass and all sorts of things come from sand.
Concrete, yeah. Glass, that's a good call, yeah.
Yeah. Now, the critical point here he makes is that we've got to get away from this childish idea, we must stop fossil fuels, straight away, stop oil now and all this sort of thing. Because the real world, the actual world that we live in, and if you've got an ounce of common sense, is pretty obvious. All this stuff is very interlinked. And paradoxically, we may need to do more short-term work in the fossil fuel area to get through to the sort of replacement era. And we've got to stop all this rubbish about talking about, stop cooking with natural gas on your gas stove and all. This is all nonsense. But of course, it's from the usual idiots in politics. And this is why politics is full of idiots. When you actually look at the hard facts, and this book is jam-packed with hard facts. He's done a lot of, excuse the pun, groundwork on all of this. And he just illustrates what a complex situation this is. And critically, that whoever controls those 6 materials, controls the world. Now, you might say, well, sand, that's everywhere. Who the hell controls sand? Well, it turns out there are all sorts of different types of sand. And needless to say, some are highly valued and they're a little bit rare and are in remote parts of the world and all the usual things. So this ties in for us a great deal with geopolitics and economics. And also, personally for me, it's a slight wake-up call to say, look, the facts here are not this binary, who cares about the planet versus we must stop everything, drop dead now. The middle road is where we're going, and it's going to be complex, and it's going to be very political, and it's got long-term implications. So to everybody, and I'm not on commission, go out and buy it and read it because it's fascinating. And as I say, Material World, here we go, Ed Conway.
No, I love it. I worked for the mining industry a few years back, and yeah, mining matters. And if you want a modern world, you need mining. Even this simple pencil, I remind people, like, it's graphite, that's a mineral, and wood, natural resource. So even if you like pencils, yeah, we just need to have a more adult, serious conversation about this stuff.
I think somebody actually wrote a book about a pencil.
And it's a great book.
How complex that is. That, it is not a trivial thing you've got on your desk there. And, okay, people go, oh, yeah, all right.
I have no trivial things on my desk.
I would be amazed if you did. It would be an even bigger shock than your revelation 2 weeks ago that Keir Starmer was energetic. Anyhow, moving on.
I'm just trying to get to checkers, man. I'm just trying to get to checkers.
No, it's not working. India's where you're going. What am I watching? Again, something you and I have talked about in the background for a few episodes now. I've got around to watching on Netflix Unchained, the sort of inside story. I think it's the heart of the peloton is the subtitle, and of course it's about the 2022 Tour de France. It is absolutely masterful and gripping. It's over 7 or 8 episodes. I think it's 8. They follow 8 teams, and it's is there a bit of playing to the camera? There may be a little bit. I don't think there's a great deal. People who want to widen their knowledge of the French language will learn to swear in at least another 10 different ways. There's quite a lot of that going on. But it is fascinating, and it's this sort of mixture of awe and thinking these guys are lunatics. And then interestingly, and this must always be a problem for inside track documentary makers, one of the main protagonists isn't in the show, which was Pogačar. I always pronounce his name slightly wrongly. The South American cyclist who's a sort of boy wonder. And his team, which was from UAE Arab Emirates, decided they didn't want to sign up for the program. That didn't mean they had no access to him, but equally he didn't have to kind of play ball and give interviews and all the rest of it. Fortunately, maybe I shouldn't give this away, he didn't actually win. He'd won in 21 and he didn't win in 22. But he's kind of a bit like Banquo's ghost in Macbeth. He's always there, but you never quite see him. But that's immaterial in the sense that this is a really, really good documentary series. And you don't have to know anything about cycling, and you might arrive thinking it's a bit boring, isn't it? I think it would change a lot of people's minds.
No, I'm with you. I'm 4 episodes in myself. Even my wife is watching it. It's fantastic. It's gripping. It's the same guys that did Drive to Survive, Box to Box film company. They really kind of captured how to do this, and the tour is fantastic. I mean, even if you don't like cycling, just the visual aspect of France is great. And the 2023 race starts July 1st in Spain, in Bilbao, Spain. This show you might enjoy, Gerald, is called Eat, Race, Win. It's from the 2017 Tour de France. What's interesting, it follows one team, an Australian team, but it follows the chef, the team, the chef who makes the food for the team. So they talk about the food and not only the logistics of moving around. Essentially, she's got a traveling kitchen, it's a food truck, but going to different farms and different kind of providers of food, but also just talking about the energy these guys burn. It's like 8,000, 10,000 calories a day. It's just absolutely insane. But that's Eat, Race, Win. That's on Amazon Prime. You might want to like that. I got 2 books for you. This is a fun book called The Docks, and this is written by a photographer, writer out of Los Angeles, and it basically talks about the port of Los Angeles and what it takes to move cargo. We take it for granted, but this is like a raw kind of globalization book, fun read. Just what it takes to move boxes in and off boats, stuff we forget about. And this is like an all-time classic, what it takes, since we've been talking about elections. This covers the 1988 election. That was the end of Reagan's term. So 88 was an open election, we would call that. That is, there was no sitting president, there was no incumbent. George H.W. Bush goes on to win that, but it follows candidates on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, what it takes, an amazing, just collection of these like wacky stories, and literally what it takes to become president, having fish fries in Alabama to raising money in New York, and just all the chaos that happens on the campaign trail. So I tell anybody who is thinking about running for any kind of office, they need to read this. And if you care about politics, Americana, it's a good book. What it takes.
No, they both sound good. Sounds good.
So that's all we got. We'll be back, I guess, in 2 weeks with another episode of Ructions.
And I will predict more of the same.
July 7th will be July 7th. So I guess we'll be a few days into the tour. And also July 7th is Nudge Stock. I don't know.
Yeah, there's Nudge Stock. Kind of cool. Indeed. Well, I'll see you in 2 weeks then.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gerald. Great to see you. Glad you're doing well. I'm excited for the the full report and a steady hip going forward, so you can be on the tour next year.
Yeah, maybe a year or two to go.
All right, ciao.
Take care.
Oh,
Bye.
speaking of which, ciao. Hey, RAI Italia, we're still waiting.